Well, thank you all for coming. And my name is Sarah Danziger. If you don't already know me, I'm the Education Program Manager here at CPW. If you don't already know where you are, you're at CPW, Center of Photography at Woodstock, formerly. And you're sitting in one of 4 of our current exhibitions. So if you haven't gotten a chance or didn't come out to our crazy opening where you couldn't move or see anything, I invite you to take a walk around the first floor after Juan's talk. We have a Mary Ellen Mark show of Ward 81. We have our community gallery, Free for All Part 1. It will be coming down this Sunday is the last day of the community show. Part 2 will be opening the following Saturday. So here on Saturday, February 22nd, there's going to be a lot of stuff going on. We're going to have an opening from 4 to 6, part 2. So a whole new 150 pieces of work by local and anyone who got to Kingston and dropped it off in person. And also we have the My Sister, Myself show, which is photography of Kathleen and Colleen Kenyon, who were twins that formerly ran CPW many moons ago. And then lastly, we have a show by Keisha Scarville. So I invite you to come take a look at those. Everything will be open again, except for the community gallery will be turning over. So this Saturday, in addition to the opening, there's also the first of a 5-part series of classes with photographer Jim Lafferty, where he'll be teaching a crash course on digital photography. So if you have questions about your digital cameras, or you want to learn how to tether, or you want to learn how to use those cool flashes and strobes, I advise you to get on that because it's going to be, I've been in his classes before, he's amazing. And lastly, we're going to be resuming our photo club, which is a free welcome friend or family friends, all ages, people to come out and learn and participate in a photographic art activity, which will be led by Cesar Castro, who's over there, who's our community engagement coordinator, but also a really amazing artist. So that's going to be fun. So if you're already coming out for the opening, bring your family, bring the young ones. Also just come as an adult, that's fine too. You'll be making collages, so, and that's free. So anything, all that free. And we also have other classes. So if the digital photography isn't your interest, but you're looking at wanting to do some photo book creation, we have Adriana Alt doing a photo book class with our new press and all of her knowledge. So anyway, come find me and ask me questions. I'll talk till your ears fall off. Okay, so you're here tonight for our weekly Meet the Artist event, all free, and always Thursday evenings. So if you're ever around, this is a good place to be. Tonight we're joined by a Rochester-based artist, Juan Orrantia. Is a Colombian photographer who spent much of his adult life in South Africa. His practice follows autobiographical threads through conditions of dislocation, post-coloniality, and representation. Through strategies like color alteration and image intervention, he makes observational and constructed images. Juan's first book, Like Stains of Red Dirt, which he has a few copies left and they're stunning. They're for sale, so please take a look later, was the winner of the Fiebre Dummy Award. He has also published A Machete Palau, which is the other book there, right? Yeah, another really beautiful book I advise you to take a look at. And a companion to A Machete as part of a publication of Riot Editorial. His books make part of the collections of MoMA, the Smithsonian Museum of African Art Library, and the Wits Museum of Art. Juan has exhibited at the Bamako Biennale, Art Photo Barcelona, Centro de la Imagen, Mexico City, and reviews of his work appear in Aperture, Nearest Truth, BJP, Africa as a Country, among others. He currently lives in the US, where he is assistant professor of fine art photography at the Rochester Institute of Technology. Can we give Juan a warm welcome? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I really want to thank Sarah, Nicole, and the CPW for organizing, and just this talk. It's really nice. I've been in the region for 2 years, and so it's really nice to also get to see people that I don't see very often. Like I also want to thank Adi Alt for also being a participant in organizing this as well. So it's really nice. So I really appreciate and it was a really nice moment, coincidence that I get to see the new space and a really great show. I feel it's funny because I'm with a collage and we're going to talk about collage and there's shadows in the next room with Keisha's work and all kinds of nice things. So I'm just gonna start. We were saying. Oh, and before I forget, if anyone just wants to ask a question whenever, just stop me whenever. It's fine. I think it's just kind of moves it along as well instead of just me. I teach so I can just talk on for a long time. So I want to start by just kind of laying out the idea that the way in which I approach photography does have to do a lot with this idea of movement and of dislocation, right? And in a way, my life has kind of moved me around from, at least 3 places that are very central for me, being Colombia, South Africa, and the US in a way. And it is this movement through these places that has really kind of shaped the way I engage photography and think about photography and consider photography. And what I want to do today then is through 3 bodies of work, which are all in book form, kind of try to open up a little bit about what that means. So I want to start with this book, and it's kind of a strange thing for me to start with because it's in a way it's my most recent book. It was published at the end of 2023, but it's a very old kind of imagery. These are photographs that were made that I made like I would say like almost like 14, 15 years ago. They were initially published as a book called Machete and Machete Pelado in Uruguay. And then the initial kind of approach of the book was that I had engaged a small town in Colombia where it was like the turf, let's say. It was the main kind of territory of this very kind of complicated figure, to say the least. He was, he had started out like in the 40s as being a farmer. He became like, was one of the first to be in the kind of drug dealing cultivation in Colombia. Then he had his own private army. And eventually he became one of his kind of private army became part of this larger network of right-wing paramilitary groups that were part of the conflict in Colombia. And this was his turf. And I knew the area just from when I was in college, but many years later, I decided to go and photograph it. And what I was really interested in photographing there was the idea of looking or being looked at and living in fear. The situation is basically that this person became quite well known in, let's say, the history of the Colombian conflict for the use of sexual violence in the Colombian conflict. So he was, but he wasn't using sexual violence as a weapon of war in a way, but as this form of almost like inherited power that the conflict in a way had created the conditions for these different things to come together. So basically you have a very strong history of patriarchy or a very patriarchal society. You have guns and you have money and you have territory. Then all of that created this situation where he was basically just abusing young girls, but they were people that he was supposedly protecting. Right, so it became this kind of very complicated use of sexual violence and understanding it in the Colombian context. But long story short, I wasn't interested in photographing quote unquote survivors or anything like that. What I was interested was in just trying to get to this idea of fear. And that was the first book, let's say. That was my first engagement with the images. But as I was kind of sitting down with this work after that, and the book kind of got the attention of the Colombian Truth Commission, and the person that was editing that work for the visual work for the Truth Commission, Santiago Escobar Jaramillo, who is an editor and has a publishing house, Raya Editorial, in Colombia. We were having conversations about like some of my, I wouldn't say frustrations necessarily, but some of the kind of complicated things that I had found when I was just looking at my images again. And I remember these types of scans that I had done, or interventions rather, that I had done on some of the images when I was just looking back at them, where I felt that something else needed to be incorporated into the work. Like the initial work was about the gaze and about trying to follow that gaze. And so a lot of the work was dealing with that. And there was a lot of metaphor. I was, just using symbolism and metaphor a lot. The way I was using color was also very interesting for me to look back, because it was also very, very kind of symbolic, very metaphoric. But I always felt that there was a limit to what I could say. And I always really was very aware, not only of my own position as a male photographing this situation, but also just the impossibility of photography to actually photograph that fear, that living in a situation like that. Because my interest was, how do you engage with that when fear becomes your everyday? So how do you photograph that? And so my initial kind of response to this form of thinking was to just make very direct and harsh interventions in the images, almost to deteriorate them. So I was just like really low risk scans of this. This was like in my little print, like my little kind of scan printer that I printed my kids' homework with. It was like really, really lo-fi. But that was kind of the thing for me, was to leave a mark in these images that were not going, that you could still see something that was happening in there, but you couldn't really tell what was going on. And that was my whole purpose with understanding photography, at least in this context, that it would never be able to actually get to where it was supposed to do, right? And that was really kind of interesting for me, to just start thinking about photography from that point of ambivalence, for that point of ambiguity. And that kind of leads me then to this second body of work, Like Stains of Red Dirt, which was published by Dalpine in 2020, where a lot of kind of this idea started to get much more developed, if you want. So when I started to make this book, I had been living in South Africa for say 9 years already. And I had not done any work in South Africa. I had photographed elsewhere in the continent. That works. I was doing the work in Colombia. I had done work in Mozambique and anywhere, other places, but I had not photographed in South Africa. And by this time, I figured, okay, I need to engage with where I'm at, what this means, and what that means for me as a photographer, right? So I really started to think about the limits of photography, right, or the so-called limits of photography, as possibilities for trying to question the image as well, but while you're still working, with images, right? So I started to photograph myself and my family and my house and my immediate surroundings. It was like a first reaction to just go back kind of to the basics, to the beginning, and really just kind of starts from scratch in a way, but just restricting myself not to the out there, which is what I had kind of been used to be doing, but really starting to think about this tension between an out there, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, about this relationship between the inside and the outside, right? And so the way I started to engage this photographically was simply by having different approaches. So I was photographing objects like still life that are just banal objects that were happening in my house. I was photographing moments that were happening. I was also doing like still lives and portraiture and kind of object studies inside my house. And you'll see this corner suddenly becomes very prevalent in the book. I just kept on coming back to this corner. And then I started as well to go outside of the house to the places that were just really close. So the park where I used to take my kid when she was a baby, just like the immediacy of all of this. And this is kind of what really took me to the idea of starting to think about how I could unsettle the image, right? How the image itself could be something that could be not necessarily broken apart, but that could be shaken up if you want to, and what the implications of that could be. I was also at this time, I was also kind of feeling, I had been living in South Africa for a long time. So I was clearly a foreigner, but I wasn't a visitor. I had met my partner who's not from there. We had our child who is from there. So suddenly we have this kind of mix of trajectories and situations all coming together. And that to me started to be, well, this is the material. This is where I can actually think about. And this is where I can start to make a difference in terms of not talking about, but talking from. That's something that became kind of really important for me, which was to make that separation. It was like I kind of stopped going and looking at something and rather actually using the experience or the history of that place to speak photographically and to think photographically from those experiences. And what I started to do was to photograph in these different ways, but what unites the whole work is color, right? And color was something that, and you'll notice that in many of the images, like colors are off, right? Like the first image of those branches of trees, which are kind of upside down, that's a jacaranda tree. That is a tree that, for example, is if you Google South Africa or Johannesburg in October, you're gonna find like a ton of photographs just full of purple images. Everybody goes out and snaps every other beautiful, gorgeous purple tree blooming on the cities of on the streets of Johannesburg. But then it was really interesting for me to learn the history of that tree, which is the tree is as foreign as I am there, right? The tree is actually I believe from South America. So when it's blooming in South Africa, it's blooming in Buenos Aires, it's blooming in Harare, in Zimbabwe, it's blooming in Nairobi. So it kind of also follows the colonial trajectory. So this was really interesting for me because I'm so used to seeing this landscape. That's not questioned, right? It's beautiful, it's there, it is what it is. And then you start unpacking it and you learn that landscape is not only not from there, but it actually brings a very complicated history with it. So in a nutshell, basically, which is a bit unfair to the tree, but the tree is an example of colonialism that's living there. Of course, the tree might not have a default, but it is the example that we forget. But we forget that it's there because it becomes a very obvious and simple thing that is just part of the landscape. The same thing with rose bushes, like things like this. So I started to really think about color in a way that for me was both conceptual and formal at the same time. So from a conceptual side, color was, I was living in a country that was completely marked by color, right? If you think about race as color, my kid going to school suddenly comes back with like as many categories of race as you can imagine because she's going through all the colors for that. In South Africa, every time you mention a name, the first thing that they ask is what color are they, or like, what are they? Are they, so are they black? Are they colored? Are they white? My kid would be, you're not white, you're kind of pink because white doesn't really exist. like all of these nuances that are so mixed in how you talk about race. And also, to me, that was really, really kind of nice to think about, also in terms of how race also is so ideologically manipulated, right? So color is very ideologically manipulated, right, in those terms. And especially, obviously, in a country like South Africa, well, or many other places, like that determined people's lives, right? Like that malleability, if you want, of something like that. So this opened up a whole set of categories for me to how to think about color and the politics of color. And then I started to think as well about the formal element of color and what it meant. And I want to read a little quote from something that I've always been found very interesting. And like I was saying, with the first body of work that I was showing, we usually tend to engage color as something that is very I'm blanking on the word right now, but basically something that adds to the photograph, right? You want to add emotion, then make it red or make it blue or whatever, make it more yellowish so it's nice and homey or whatever, right? It's like this thing that we add to the photograph, right? Rather than as something that is integral to the photograph, right? And I remember when I was thinking about this, and there's this quote by Roland Barthes, which I found fascinating for this idea, which is, and Barthes in Camera Lucida says, I always feel that in the same way, color is a coating applied later onto the original truth of the black and white photograph. For me, color is an artifice, a cosmetic, like the kind used to paint corpses. And I think, I mean, and if you haven't done, and if you ever want to have a real laugh at what happens sometimes in this photo world, look at the reviews of Eggleston's show at MoMA when they first had that show. They're hilarious because it's just like they're as destructive as they come. They're making fun of why would you use like commercial techniques of color that are so horrible and so anti-photographic. Like this history that we carry in photography with color, to me was always very interesting for that. And I always had an interest in collage, which I love that I have around. And so if you think about the basics of collage, well, it's basically taking an image apart to do something, at least to the image, at minimum, and if not, at least to create at least the possibility of creating something new. So I started to think about color as collage, right? So what if you think about color as an element of the photograph? That can be manipulated as well, right? As an integral thing. So it's not that different than going back into the dark room, right? But it was really kind of thinking about, okay, if I can change colors in the photograph as if I were cutting and pasting, then what can that do to the photograph? And it was interesting for me then to think about also that in relationship to representations. So what happens if I take a photograph of a plant that quote unquote look very tropical with the imaginaries that brings, and this kind of magenta pink thing is in the middle of it. But if I say that because this is South Africa, people will think that it could be fairly true, because why not? That's what happens in those places, right? And we've been taught to see certain places through very particular lenses, right? I remember one day, there was a very interesting, I was showing the work to someone who had not lived in South Africa, had never been in South Africa, and they were looking at the work and they said, but this doesn't look like South Africa. And I was like, well, it's kind of funny that I actually live there. I'm photographing my house, which is in South Africa, and you're telling me what it doesn't look like. And to me, that's what, the history of representations does, And so I wanted to play with that on both sides, right? On the side that I'm showing the rose as a simple rose, but then to kind of change it and to think about it in what we don't see about it. And in the same way to play with the idea of what people think they're seeing when they're seeing something. There's a lot of seeing when I talk and in my work, but that really kind of became what was really kind of guiding this, was like, things are not necessarily what they seem. Yeah. So so this is it can be whatever you want, right? On the one hand, what I started to do was that, so here comes the revelation, but I was basically photographing with a lot of cellophane paper, which is what I guess I'm kind of lo-fi in general. So I went lo-fi I didn't want any gels. I didn't want fancy lights. I was just doing it super basic. And so the way I was photographing was that I was just covering a tiny little flash that I always had on the camera, sometimes with one, sometimes with two, sometimes half of it. And eventually what I started to do was that I started to incorporate what I was using to alter the color as part of the photographs. And you'll start to see in some of the photographs that, I mean, some of them are more direct, like this one. Others, like pieces of cellophane, kind of come in. You see that a lot through shadows, which are also really important in the work. How the colors change the shadows, let's say, but it was basically going back to the 60s and just, like thinking back to what filmmakers were doing in the 60s, which was, I'm going to show you that what you're doing is not true, and I'm going to show you the tripod, and I'm going to show you a camera. So I just, and the way I kind of came into photography was thinking through kind of film and the essay film, and so I was always very interested in these elements of montage and kind of like making the representation obvious or visible at least. And that's what I started to do. So I started to really incorporate it. What it also helped me was to start to also think about the idea of covering and uncovering. So the work in a way starts to have these dichotomies. So you have kind of the idea of natural and the artificial. So you can think about, so we learned that there's natural and there's artificial light. What does that mean? And that then helps me think, well, what is artificial and what is natural, right? And if you're thinking in the context that I was working, for example, well, families suddenly were artificial and illegal, right? But what is a family? What is a person? What is gender? Like they're all categories that get pinpointed, but that if we think about it, they don't necessarily behave that way, right? So I was very interested in the points of connection or of tension where those things were kind of happening. And so there's a lot of imagery like this one where I'm really literally situated in those spaces between either something that's being covered or uncovered or something that's inside or outside, and the tensions that happen with that, right? So there's different photographs that then start to play with what these categories mean, right? So natural, artificial helps me think about the plants, but it also helps me think about race, about family. Inside, outside helps me think about my own relationship as with belonging, right? What is it that's out there, and what is it that it's in here? What is that country? What is it? How does it belong to me? Do I belong to it? What happens? My daughter, of course, was very instrumental in that, because it is through her that a lot of this history kind of comes to me. It's never going to be me. It's never going to be mine. I'm not going to be experiencing the racism, for example, in my body, but she will, right? So how does that happen when I'm thinking about it as a father? So all of these things are basically like kind of little undertones that are part of the work that I just wanted to engage with from the simplicity of the everyday, right? So I'll just make like a kind of very typical still life with objects from the place, from my everyday, and then just play a little bit with the colors there and what happens there, and just change the colors and alter them. And a lot of these images then also start to just kind of have their own possibility of what they could be. So that's why I was kind of saying, like, at one point it could be whatever, right? And a lot of the implications in a way that the work could have don't necessarily have to be in the photograph, right? And that was something that was really interesting for me from kind of working in this way of just letting go, right? Letting go, opening it up, but at the same time kind of trying to pull certain elements of the photograph that would kind of in a way keep it in my orbit if you want. So there's other photographs like this where, I mean, there's only one photograph where you can actually see my daughter, and I think two where you can see my partner. But a lot of that has to do with this, right? And so when I was talking about artificial and natural, for example, I always think about this photograph for that, because like the real flowers in the photograph are dead and devoid of color. And this is a protea flower. None of you have ever seen a protea. It's the national flower of South Africa. They're gorgeous. They're beautiful. The colors are amazing. But we have them dead in the house, and they are dry, so no color theoretically. But then the plastic flowers that we had on the wall, those are full of color. And then what is the red? Is it coming from the outside because it's the nighttime, or is that me playing with it? You know, like just what I wanted was basically to engage with the idea that things are not necessarily what they seem, right? They could be, and that means that there's other things in there, right? So Johannesburg is a city that is, oh, you have a, oh, yeah. So Johannesburg is actually built over mines, and they're all gold mines. But the history of the mines and the history of Johannesburg is all based on migrant labor that were coming from from all over the country, but also from a lot of other countries around. And they were always coming to work in the gold mines. So you literally live over gold mines. Well, they're kind of not that much anymore. And what I wasn't necessarily making a reference to that, but I was just playing with the idea of changing. So these are actually pieces of coal that I'm photographing. And to be honest, I was playing with cellophanes, and one of them looked like gold. And I'm like, okay, I can push the color a little bit and blah, blah, blah. But that's kind of where it goes. And the way I play with that kind of ambiguity in the book is with these kind of series of vignettes that the book has at the end. So some of these things, of course, you don't get from seeing a photograph, right? But what I was kind of playing was that if I'm considering all of these images to be just fragments of every day, right, which is how I was seeing it, and the way the book is constructed is literally just this very non-linear narrative that is just full of little interruptions. Each of them is a fragment. I can say more a little bit about that, but we decided that we wanted some sort of these little snippets of these undercurrents to be part of the work itself as well in the book. And so I wrote a series of little vignettes that kind of wanted to resemble the way in which I was photographing. So if I have my camera there while we're having supper and then I get up and I make a photograph, let me think what we talked about, maybe not in that dinner, but like what is a dinner conversation, right? And sometimes it could be a super banal thing, and others it could be it's a holiday in South Africa. What is the holiday today, Papa? Well, today is the day that we are remembering it's a holiday because it's the 1976 massacre of students or something like that, right? And what does that mean, right? And so these little pieces, how these little moments also bring together all of these histories. So the book has a series of vignettes. So for example, this one, I have a little vignette that refers to the use of these kind of strategies, so to speak, that the apartheid regime had when they didn't know how to classify a person, which again takes me back to the ambiguity. Not even, right, the racist regime could actually define the categories of race so clearly, right? So they got quote unquote confused, they didn't know what to do with a person. And so at some point in history, they had these mechanisms to try to define that. And one of them was called the pencil test, which was basically they would put a pencil in a person's hair and they would make them shake their head. And if the hair fell, then if the pencil fell, they would be classified more on the colored side because they were closer to the white spectrum. And if they didn't, then they would clearly be labeled black, right? But that ambiguity kind of, which I'm using in the photograph, kind of then feeds into the work through these little vignettes, right? And then a lot of them are just like titles that I use and things like that. So yeah, there's images like these where this is like what I was referring to, where all of these elements, or not all of them, but like the different elements start to come together in the photographs, right? So you don't necessarily see the paper, but you see the effects of the paper, and then there's like, then shadows become shadows of shadows. There's references to the place, but and then there's gestures. And something that I was forgetting to mention was something that I was very interested was also in not portraiture, but I guess, can you say gestureture? But I was really interested in just looking at moments by separating the person and thinking about the little intimacy of the moment, right? I always think that a portrait sometimes is just too much. And if you just cut out the face and you think about the body itself, something else can happen, right? And so that's why, like, there's one, let's say, or two official portraits in the book, let's say, maybe three, but most of this are like that. So yeah, so then in the work was really where I was playing with this idea of manipulation, thinking about manipulation as like a formal, but at the same time kind of conceptual, maybe political approach. And others are just little banal moments, like, I don't know why we collect our kids' teeth, but we do, and there they are, but they have to be changed in reds and yellows and oranges and stuff like that. And so the process for me became really interesting. I was saying, because I was thinking about the darkroom now, because I always, it's not that different from that, but I started to really look at my images differently. So I would make a photograph with the burst of the color, but I wasn't controlling that. So whatever I had supposedly been so controlling in my composition and blah, 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 suddenly got changed because of the flash of the color that had been put there. And I wasn't, like I was saying, I wasn't directing it in a way. I was just letting it do its thing. And then I would sit down and look at that photograph and then start to really kind of think about what had happened to what I had in my head when I was supposedly making the photograph, and then what I was seeing by seeing the photograph again in a way that I had not visualized it when I was making it. And then I would really start to just paint and draw and change it to whatever I wanted it to be. So that was kind of also a way for me to kind of thinking about, from a kind of formal aspect, thinking about this idea of covering and uncovering, right? What is it that I'm revealing? What is it that I'm not revealing? And then that kind of becomes what is natural, what is not natural, and stuff like that. So yeah, so this is like Stains of Red Dirt. Oh, and maybe I'll just finish by saying, I think the book is there, but anyway. The way we kind of organized it structurally in terms of the book to kind of add it once it becomes an object was that the book comes covered in a dust jacket made of acetate, right? And so the first thing that you see is that red cover, but you know that it's not attached. And you know that if you move it, whatever's underneath is going to change. Then you see that happening in the photographs themselves, right? So that becomes part of the narrative itself, right? And the other thing that the book has, and I think I have one here, yeah. So then so the book begins with the cover, and then the first page of the book is, the reverse of this one, but it is this little color bar, right? And so all of these fragments and all of these things that I've been saying about, ambiguity and all of that and da-da-da-da, well, it's not that simple, right? Because there is a history there that is kind of controlling a lot, or has controlled a lot of this. And so my reference to that was to go back to the Shirley card. And I don't know if people are familiar with the Shirley card, but basically the Shirley card has become kind of a way of thinking about what some people refer to as the racial bias of photography, right? So the Shirley card was when, especially like kind of like everyday kind of commercial, not commercial, like everyday, your, birthday pictures was, color photography was made accessible in a way. Colors were rendered in a way for white skin, basically, right? So if you had people of color, if there was a white skinned person in the photograph, they would come out properly exposed, but not the person of color, right? And the darker the skin, the more they would get subdued into the void of the photograph, right? And so this kind of, so the Shirley card was, so Kodak had these color balancing cards that they would send to the labs, or that they had in their labs, where people would send their film, and then they had these cards which had a neutral, right? And the neutral is a white-skinned woman, right? So for many years, that was the normal, quote unquote. And so that's why, well, it's not surprising that, you know, certain colors, I mean, it has to do also with the nature of the films themselves. They weren't actually, the reactors for reds and browns were not necessarily that prevalent in the films, et cetera, et cetera. But the point being that there is a history that is framing this way of working in a way, or these ideas, right? And so I also wanted to kind of speak to that by bringing the color bars into the book. So yeah, so that's kind of the second book. Is there any questions on that, or should I just keep on going? All right, I'll remember something that I probably forgot to say. So the last work that I kind of wanted to share today was this other book called Juan Sin Miedo, which translates to Juan No Fear, and it is kind of a pun on my name, but it just happens to be that it's not just my name, right? So Juan Sin Miedo was the section of a newspaper that was what do you call it? A sensationalist newspaper that was very popular when I was growing up. And the newspaper always had this, the back of the newspaper was the section called Juan Sin Miedo, which was the pinup section, right? And then when I was growing up in like the late 90s in Colombia, this was hanging in the kiosk where we would be waiting for the school bus, whatever. And I always kind of, well, when I think about it now, I started to think about like, this was basically like my first manual of sexuality, right? This is how I was being taught on the streets of Bogota how to be a man, right? And so I wanted to do something with this idea because there was, and this is a really bad photograph because I was just kind of rummaging through my, old files when I was making the images in the archive. But this is what the newspaper kind of looked like. This is a bit one that's a bit a little bit more out there because it has to do with a very big bombing that had taken place in Bogota. But this was the cover of the newspaper, right? So you would have a big bombing. This is actually the equivalent of the FBI building in Bogota that was bombed by Pablo Escobar. And then you have little tricks to use in bed, as really big in the headline. And then you have, and there was 12 gunshots, but because it was like somebody was in a Chevette car, right? And that all gets mixed up with this woman in the middle. And then this was the preview that you would go into in the back, right? To then be able to see it big, and it was always hanging up in all kinds of places. But this kind of relationship between masculinity and violence was really important, like for me, to think through. These are other kind of the images that were kind of coming from there. I know they are what they are. But these, like when I started to, I had an interest in this and I started to photograph these newspapers, right? But then I started to collect magazines in South Africa as well. And I was very interested in the magazines from the 80s and the 90s, which was a period of apartheid that was very violent, right? Like the quote unquote end of apartheid, it was bloody, right? The end. And I started to look at men's magazines from that time, and it wasn't that different. Okay, there wasn't a bombing, but there was a rape. There was, it was like a story of a rape, and then you illustrated, like all of these weird things that were happening of just speaking about that would just speak about the relationship between violence and masculinity, and this is how men are growing up in a way. And these are, these are magazines that are to be consumed and ads and stuff like that. So I started to then mix the two materials together. And then my first approach was to start like editing the photographs like a newspaper editor or magazine editor would do, to just go in for the crop with my little crayon, to kind of make certain parts of those images more visible, if you want. The ones that I was feeling were kind of speaking of some sort of violence or something. And then I started to sometimes put them together with other of the images. But then I started was to actually use old prints of mine to use them as the dialogue, right? So these images wanted to be in dialogue with prints, and so some prints are from Colombia, some prints are from South Africa, etc. But I wanted to kind of start to mix these two things, right? And what I was thinking here was, obviously on the lines I had never really, I mean, for all the thinking about collage and this, I had actually not done collage, like by hand, more or less. And I started to do them, and I also realized that wasn't cutting it for me. And what I was interesting was in just dealing with the form photographically, right? And so I started to rephotograph all of these little arrangements, and I call them reassemblages, because the idea was to think about possibilities in which one can reassemble the ideas of imagery of white masculinity, right? And that's kind of what I started to do. I kind of knew that this was really going to be like or I wanted it to be a very material project, coming out of the other book, which was a kind of more, like quote unquote photographic object. These ones, I wanted them to be much more tactile, right? And because it was about newspapers or with newspapers and magazines, I thought initially that risograph or, risograph would be really nice for it because of the form, and the history of it. But so I was working with a risograph printer in South Africa, Dreampress, and Candace, the printer, was really interested in just pushing the idea of what the risograph could do. And I don't know how familiar people are with risograph printing, but it's basically a digital screen print, right? It's this Japanese machine that kind of just produces a lot of posters. It's very good for posters, and you print through inks. You don't print all the inks at the same time. And that's what was very important for the work, because the way it works is that you print like the yellow ink, the red ink, right? But every time you're printing it, you have to take the block of papers that have been printed through that ink and put them back into the machine. So then you obviously get a lot of misprints and misalignment sometimes. You do what I do with the microphone all the time, and then you hit the machine and that thing moves. And I remember, so I had made like 10 or 11 of these photographs, and we were test printing them on risograph. And then I was one day at the studio talking to Candice, and she had these things lying around the studio. And I'm like, what are these things that are lying around? And she's like, oh, that's just like, junk that I have to get rid of. And then we were really talking about it. And it's like, how can you get rid of this? These are like really, really like interesting things that are happening with these misprints. And then we started to just talk about the work, and we thought it would be really nice to incorporate the printing process into the collage itself, right? So that it wouldn't just be me doing the reassembled photographs, but that we could start to think about different ways related to photography or the photographic process and the printing process that were ways of reassembling as well. Right. And so what we started to do was that I told Candice, just, and Candice's assistant, they just started to print things like crazy, and at the end we had a massive pile of these misaligned prints, if you want, that And of course, I totally forgot to bring my copy of the book to all this talk about the materiality of the object. And here it's not. So you have to see it on the screen. But so we made 25 copies. And what we did was that we had the 11 or 12 images that I made were kind of in one section of the book on one particular stock of paper. And then all the other ones became unique objects, right? Because we just started to play with these images. And to be honest, like the best editing session I've ever had. The three of us in the studio, laughing, playing music, and I take this one. No, I take that one. Let me give it to that. No, I dibs on that one. And each one was making little piles, which each one is a unique book, right? So not, so there's not two of these because they were just misaligned prints. And it was really nice to kind of incorporate that kind of as a second strategy of reassembling images in the book. And then the third kind of strategy that we decided was to go back to the originals, let's say, right? I had all of these magazines that were all cut up and pieces of newspaper that I don't know what I'm going to do with that. And we said, why don't we do something else as well with them? And so I'll eventually get to them while we go through all of these misalignments. There we go. So I started to take their originals and I started to reprint again in my little printer that I had used for the other scans. The printer did not survive. It's no longer works. I put everything through it just to kind of see what I could do, just reprinting pieces of magazine and newspapers. But I was basically like trying to play with this idea. This was published in a magazine. This was published as a newspaper. I extracted some of those images and then I'm putting them back in another magazine. I'm putting them back in another cover. And then I started to just collage these things with books and different elements. And some of them were where I was kind of painting on them, and some of them were to be a bit more obvious, like to kind of point to the hidden meaning, text, whatever marketing strategy that was there. This is an ad for a washing machine, if you're wondering what it is. But yep, that's what it was. So I kind of really started to make those things. So I started to think about, okay, I'm going to think about these magazines like the editor would think about the photograph. So I'm just, what is the quote unquote part that needs to be revealed or needs to be hidden? So I started to play with these things. Others, I was just juxtaposing more kind of things about violence, for example, and some of the text, just kind of using basic strategies of collage for that. And what we did then was at the end that we took each one of these objects and then we glued them onto paper, bookbinding paper, and then we use that for a wraparound for the books. So then each book carries its own different strategies of how to deal with whatever is happening inside. So yeah, so basically all of these kind of strategies and ways of engaging with the fact that I don't know where I live, that I have lived here, that one foot is in South Africa, the other one is in Colombia, the other one is in Rochester. Like, I started to really think and just engage it instead of fighting it, right? And it's been really kind of nice for me to think what it does photographically, and to how I can think about the medium as well. That's why I go back to that thing about it's not about, but it's from, like, if you get immersed, like if I am thinking about what it meant to be living in South Africa or living in this situation, or just seeing these images because they remind me of, well, they don't remind me, they were what I was looking at when I was a teenager, like how does that make me think about photography now? And how can I think about photography? But how does that translate into photographs as well, right? So not just a spiel about it, but how can that become a photograph? And that's kind of where I'm at the moment. I don't have photographs of where I'm at the moment. but for different reasons. But yeah, I'm kind of now just putting all of these things together, and kind of just thinking photographically from that space. So that is kind of my spiel on my work. So yeah, if anybody has any question or things that they want to share, yeah, whoever wants to go.
What your thoughts were on, you said you're from Colombia?
I am, yeah.
So like, because I'm seeing like one thing that's like really sold here is like from Colombia to America. It's like, basically, how do you feel about it being so right-wing right
I think you can look at the work and that would answer some of the questions. I mean, I've thought about if I need, like, if that were something that would come into the work, or the way I guess I think about your question is if I would incorporate that into the work. I think there's things that would happen in many types of work. I mean, I think that what's happening in the States right now is so big that you can address it from so many perspectives. That where I kind of see it is that if it's a form of, in a way, it's a form of speaking back, right? And that's how I think about it. So it's so for a long time for me, it's been about speaking back about certain canons in photography, right, and certain histories in photography. But at the same time, I think with the kind of conditions of where I'm working from right now, I think some of those elements are just part of how I'm responding to the work. But, and I guess I'm kind of rambling a little bit, but I wouldn't necessarily address, I'm probably not going to have, like something that refers directly to the States in the photograph. Because for me, it's more like the way I think about the States is the way I think about the studio in a way, is that, and increasingly my work is, I mean, I'm photographing like right now in South Africa, in Colombia, and in the studio. But it's here where these things kind of start to mix and match. So the studio, suddenly maybe I don't use a photograph that I made in South Africa as a photograph. It becomes part of an object or an installation in the studio that I'm photographing, right? And so it's more about how this place as well is making me think about what I've been doing and how I've been thinking about the other. So I guess in a kind of very long route, that would be how I'm thinking as well about what's happening here as well. Because a lot of the issues are not, I mean, like you can put them in the boxes of what's happening here as well. But Abby?
I mean, to me, it seems like from the beginning of your talk, where you talk about this kind of underlying constant fear of, just the man coming down and doing what he wants. It feels like it's kind of coming full circle, even though you've come to a place that is supposedly less. I mean, even coming from South Africa, especially, which is, I mean, I think you said it to me back in the day. I think racism and sexism is bad in the States. It's like on steroids in South Africa. It's just not to compare one to the other, but it seems like to me now it's just kind of like flows through every part of everywhere. And here you come to Rochester, which is also scary in a lot of ways, but you started your photographic world in your understanding of your photographic world in this place up here, and you kind of come to that universal thread that's threading all of these different places together. So it's really interesting hearing you come as an outsider, but you're coming with your inside knowledge of something that you really just completely erased from every moment of every day. And lots of people in the United States have to just Some of your images are a little bit more sexual than they are violent. I find like kind of feminine, like lots of tits and ass, and then like a mountainside. It feels like it kind of rides on the edge of kind of giving that voice a little bit more volume than like how are you navigating the world between violence and sexuality and using these like kind of pin-up women and without emphasizing the fact that they are not women.
Yeah, that's a hard one.
So for me, that makes me feel slightly uncomfortable. But I'm just kind of wondering how you navigate that in your work.
I think my initial approach was when I was making the photographs. Sorry, let me just gonna go fast, like to these, right? Like, but where I'm photographing, right? So I feel I was a bit more in control of what I was kind of selecting and just rephotographing. And I think in these, I had more elements to work with, like let's call them photographic elements that I could add to the picture to participate in that dialogue, to do something else in a way that than the straightforward collages don't. And I think that I agree. I think it's also, I guess, for me, to thinking it back, is I guess the actual object kind of has its own weight, right? So if I see that newspaper, I really see it differently than when I see the photograph of it, right? Like to me, that one takes me back to that moment, while the photograph is where I'm at now, and I'm engaging with it now. So I think maybe that could be what, like comes out as well, because it's, I guess, I hadn't thought about it much, but I guess I'm handling them slightly differently, right? Sure. Another one that I hadn't thought about. I don't know, honestly. I think that when I was making this work, I had a kind of relatively clear stance of how I was engaging it. And I think when I was just absorbing them, I was just absorbing them, right? And it's kind of many years of I've had those pictures of the newspapers as well in my archive for a long time. I just never knew what to do with them. And I try to put them in all kinds of works and they would fit and they would not fit. And, and I kind of never knew what to do with them. But it was only when I was seeing that what I felt now, what those photographs or those images did, was happening not just in my Colombian newspaper, but it was also happening in other magazines. Then they clicked for me. And that's when I said, now I know, because it's not just about this particular thing, right? And that's when I was like, this is not about the photographs. This is not about the images. This is about white masculinity, right? This is how a lot of us were raised in many different parts, right? And this is a lot of imagery that a lot of people were seeing in different ways, which is why I started to combine them. Right? Because they were seeing it in South Africa, we were seeing it in Colombia, we didn't say that, but like, if you look at the pinups, for example, I mean, one of the first things that I started to notice when I started to photograph them is they're clearly not Latin women. They're all stock models from who knows what agency that, this newspaper was buying those images from. One would assume they were buying them. But, so that it was the putting them together. And I think that's kind of, I don't know if your question kind of addresses a little bit of that, but it was for me that thinking about the different trajectories and what happens when you start to put different trajectories together, that then another view can happen, right? And I was feeling that. Instead of like, oh, do I think I'm a Colombian, but I'm not South African, but what do I, instead of keep on complicating my life like that, it's just like, well, what happens if you just look at the two at the same time, right? And that's where I think I kind of started to engage it in that way. Sure, you and...
Now, what I'm seeing the threads between your experience in South Africa and in Colombia and here, right? So, like race, color, literally, sexuality, all these common threads in these three different places. I would say that the racism here just as it is based out right next to living there is important. But my larger question is, are there any other topics that came up for you that throughout the work that you're like, oh, I see the similarities, right? I see the parallels that you may want to explore later.
I had that idea in the beginning. Like when I started working, I initially started working like on questions of memory and violence. And I had done a work like that in Colombia. It was much more like installation wise. But then I thought, oh, I can do that in Mozambique. And then I did a whole work on that because I was thinking, okay, these experiences could be similar even though they're very different, right? I think that has really changed in a way for me because my whole way of thinking about how I think about work has changed in a way throughout the years. So it's not about this place or about that place, right? So what is happening in that place? Is it similar to this other place? It does. Now it's just, I'm actually like not even thinking about what I'm working on in a way. I'm really just responding, and when I look at the images that I am making, that I made last year in South Africa, they're all still lives. They might be outside in a place that I was photographing. They're all still lives. Whether you put them inside the studio or not, they're all kind of the same, So it's kind of like much more, and that's why I didn't want to show the images. But that's why I'm much more thinking through what I'm responding to with these ideas than trying to put the ideas into the work itself, which is how I started. And I think some of these works were my way of navigating myself out of that, or navigating through that rather. So I don't know if that answers your question if I'm going total wishy-washy, but okay. Oh, that's a good one. Joe, why do I give to the students? I sometimes, no, there is one that I give like to the, what do you call them? The first years? The freshmen, thank you. I still can't remember those things. I make them bring a problematic photo, for example. Like some of them come thinking, oh, I do sports photography. Well, bless you. And then I'm like, well, can you actually think about what a problematic photograph looks like? So I do that, but then I can also go and make them photograph something that makes them feel uncomfortable. So I don't know, those are two that kind of come up from my head. Sure.
I wanted, like, I'm really fascinated with like your first book with little like like what made you come there? Did he invite you?
No.
Were you, like, petrified?
So basically, I mean, he wasn't, I only saw him once, but that was before I thought. So what took me there was I had passed to that place many times when I was in college, and I had encountered the situation, I had seen the guys with the big guns, and I saw him once, and that was petrifying. He didn't give a rat's butt about me, like he's in power. He's this little college kid, who cares? But I thought it was like super scary. But I always had that. And then many years later, when I was already living in South Africa, I always felt that I really needed to go back there and photograph that place. He was already in jail. He was actually extradited here. His army, in a way, had kind of been demobilized, even though we knew who had been the commander there and stuff like that. But that's why I wanted to go back. I really wanted to go back, and because in Colombia, I grew up with a lot of people, not necessarily, yes, legitimizing them, not him necessarily, like not the rapes, whatever. Although at that time, but it was like legitimized in some parts of Colombian society. And I really wanted to go back, but I also wanted to it was the time of thinking about the Truth Commission and what was going to happen and what was coming out. And I felt that I wanted to just go and really try to engage with what it meant to live in a place like that. The war in Colombia was like all outside, and in the cities, we had some bombs at one point, but it wasn't like for 50 years in your backyard, like in your yard. It was your backyard, but no. So then that's kind of why I went back. But it was also like, he was not around. I was just hanging out with the women. I would, it was kind of just done in that kind of way. It was facing my fear as a way of, I was engaging with the idea of fear, like what it could have been. And I guess in a part, it was kind of engaging mine as well. Not to see what I could do with it, but just because I really wanted to kind of engage the idea of fear in a photograph.
And I'm so glad you came and spoke tonight. I'm really noticing also in your work, like in your second book, that you did with your family, how all of these things culminate. I mean, your family is from like 3 different countries, and you're all like dealing with each other, kind of carrying around that as you go from place to place. But there's even though you're addressing the issue of color in that work, it also feels like very loving and very warm. There's a lot of things that you're doing with color and tinting and flash and all these things, but there's also just like a really deep sense of care in those pictures I find. And so, like there's something that is different from that project to the ones, the photograph and the collages that are kind of like about something, opposed to, like you were saying, like it was coming from you and not you looking at it. So really notice the difference in that, and they're both great.
No, but absolutely. And I usually kind of get carried away with the color, but for me, like that, what I mean by the inside as well was the tensions, and some of the images are about, or not about, but like some of the images are like have the tension in them, I would hope, and others have like the more tender moments as well, and that's part of the juxtaposition of all of these kind of frictions, right? And that's why I kind of emphasize as well the idea of how I started to work from that, and I guess something that does, just to kind of round it up, but like something that was also a decision for the book was how we would let each image have its own breathing space. You saw the first maquette. It was like all over the place. It was super jumbly, like it was tensions and frictions and da da da. And then like in the actual book was like, I wanted the space to be there so that like you could just sit down and see what you could see in there. And it's not just the political or the complicated history that's behind it, but also just what it is, which is what it is. This is the everyday me there living with them and bugging my daughter, or what that is, to make a photograph. So that's it as well. Well, thank you very, very much, everyone. Thanks, Nicole. Yeah.